This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and much more dangerous. For years, you were told the rules were stable, that when a court spoke, the country listened, that your rights did not depend on geography. That assumption is now unstable, not because of chaos, but because of order, because a system decided calmly, procedurally, that its own limits matter more than uniform outcomes. What looks like a technical correction is actually a pressure release. And once pressure is released unevenly, it does not rebalance. It migrates. You won't feel this all at once. That's the risk. If you care about how power actually moves, not how it's described, stay with me. Because what just shifted does not announce itself loudly. It changes how the country functions, one boundary at a time. And the next boundary is closer than you think. What actually controls this system is not ideology, not elections, not even outcomes. It's leverage, specifically who is allowed to stop a rule for everyone else and who is not. For a long time, a single legal move could freeze reality nationwide. One filing, one judge, one pause button for the entire country. That was never advertised as power. It was described as efficiency, as protection, as order. But in practice, it rewired control because the fight stopped being about whether a law was right. It became about where you filed first. That quiet shift changed behavior across the system. States adapted, agencies adapted, advocacy groups adapted, and now that leverage is being pulled back, not redistributed, removed, which means power doesn't disappear. It relocates. And when power relocates inside a federal system, it doesn't land gently. It fractures. That fracture is already forming. And the next part is where it becomes visible. This did not begin last night. That's the part that makes it dangerous. Before, legal power moved slowly. Cases traveled upward, rules hardened over time. Uniformity arrived late, but it arrived. Now, speed replaced patience. Temporary orders became permanent reality. Emergency relief became default governance. What used to be exceptional was normalized quietly, procedurally. For nearly 2 decades, the system trained itself to expect immediate, universal pauses, not after full trials, not after final rulings, but early, fast, wide. That changed incentives. It taught everyone to race, to file first, to pick locations, not arguments. And when a system optimizes for speed, it stops asking whether the structure can hold. Slow change is the most effective change because no alarm sounds until the moment the assumptions underneath it give way. That moment has now arrived. And the first visible shock is already unfolding. Within hours, the system reacted. Not emotionally, operationally. Legal teams didn't debate philosophy. They filed fast. Across multiple fronts, states moved first because they had been waiting not to win, but to unfreeze. Laws that had been suspended sometimes for years suddenly re-entered the real world. Not everywhere, just in some places. And that distinction matters more than it sounds because enforcement does not wait for clarity. It follows permission. Agencies recalculated, governors announced timelines. Courts received emergency motions asking a single question. How far does this order reach now? No one had a uniform answer. That's the shock. Not disagreement, but simultaneity, multiple realities activating at once. Different rules. Same constitution. If you're trying to understand why this matters, don't look at who benefits. Look at who has to decide today what the law even is. If you want to understand what comes next, stay with me. Because this is only the first stress test, and the mechanism underneath it hasn't finished moving yet, here's the part that stays mostly invisible. When broad relief disappears, the burden doesn't lift evenly. It concentrates. Those with resources adapt first. They file in more places, hire more lawyers, absorb delay as strategy. Those without resources wait or comply or fall through gaps no one is tracking yet. This is how the mechanism works now. Protection becomes proportional to persistence. Relief becomes fragmented by design. The system still claims neutrality. Same rules, same courts, but access has changed. Because when a rule only shields named parties, everyone else becomes collateral. Not by intent, by structure. Damage doesn't show up as a single failure. It arrives as repetition, the same challenge, the same harm, relitigated again and again. That repetition benefits institutions that can endure and drains those that cannot. This isn't ideological. It's mechanical. And once a system runs on mechanics instead of outcomes, it accelerates quietly. You can already see the pace increasing. More filings, more uncertainty, more divergence, which brings us to the second shock, the faster one. This is where it speeds up. Rules don't wait. They activate. In one place, enforcement resumes. In another, it stays frozen. Same policy, different outcome. Movement follows borders. So does risk. Agencies adjust on the fly. Guidance changes, then changes again. Compliance becomes guesswork. Courts are flooded, not with final arguments. With emergency clarifications, how wide, how far, who counts? Each answer creates another question. Delay multiplies. Costs rise. Timelines collapse. What used to be national becomes local. What used to be settled becomes provisional. And the system starts producing contradictions faster than it can resolve them. That's not chaos yet. It's pre-chaos. The kind that feels technical, administrative, manageable, until it reaches people who don't have the option to wait for consistency. That's the point where this stops being abstract and starts landing somewhere much closer, right where you live. Here's where this reaches you, not as theory, as timing, because when rules vary by location, your margin for error disappears. What's permitted on one side of a line becomes punishable on the other. You don't get a notice. You get consequences. You follow guidance that changes midstream. You rely on protections that exist until they don't. And the burden shifts quietly onto you to know which version of the law applies today, not this year. Today, that's not neutrality. That's transfer. The system transfers uncertainty downward, onto individuals, onto families, onto anyone without the ability to litigate their way back to safety. If this feels disorienting, that's not an accident. Disorientation is how fragmentation spreads without resistance. If you want to understand why this matters beyond any single issue, stay with me. Share this. Follow the pattern, not the headline. Because once uncertainty becomes normal, the system doesn't slow down. It expands. And now, it's no longer contained inside the country. Systems like this don't exist in isolation. They signal when enforcement fragments internally, it changes how the country is read from the outside. Not as a single authority, but as a variable one. International agreements rely on predictability. So do markets. So do institutions that interact with federal rules, assuming consistency. When consistency becomes conditional, confidence recalculates. Regulators abroad start asking which version applies. Companies hedge. Allies hesitate. Not because of disagreement, because of uncertainty. A rule that holds in one jurisdiction but collapses in another is no longer a standard. It's a suggestion. That ripple feeds back inward. Pressure increases, deadlines compress. And the system compensates the only way it knows how. By accelerating decision-making at the top, that's how fragmentation invites centralization at the same time. A paradox that feels temporary, but rarely is. What's forming now isn't a stable patchwork. It's a moving one. And the faster it moves, the fewer options remain that don't involve forceful correction. That brings us to the future paths, not outcomes. Paths. From here, the system has 3 directions it can move, not predictions, pressures. The first is adjustment. Courts narrow faster, agencies clarify. Congress intervenes just enough to reimpose baseline rules. Uniformity doesn't return fully, but it stabilizes at a cost. Higher barriers, slower access. More friction for anyone without institutional backing. The second path is erosion. Fragmentation becomes routine. Geographic variation hardens. People learn to live with conditional rights. Businesses adapt. Agencies improvise. Courts normalize inconsistency as procedural reality. Nothing breaks dramatically. It just thins. The third path is rupture. Timing matters here. When variation collides with elections, enforcement, or crisis response, when contradictory rules can't coexist long enough to be managed. That's when emergency power expands to compensate rapidly, decisively, without waiting for consensus. None of these paths announce themselves clearly. They overlap. They borrow from each other, and the danger isn't choosing the wrong one. It's sliding into one without realizing it. Because once acceleration locks in, reversing direction becomes exponentially harder. Nothing about this resolves cleanly. It can't. A system built on uniform assumptions is now operating on conditional ones. And conditional systems don't fail all at once. They thin. You won't notice the exact moment when a right becomes a privilege, or when enforcement becomes selective, or when emergency decisions replace deliberation as the norm. By the time those shifts feel obvious, they've already been integrated. What matters now is not outrage, or allegiance, or even agreement. What matters is attention, because power doesn't need secrecy to expand. It only needs complexity and fatigue. If you stop tracking how the rules change, where they apply, to whom, and why, someone else decides that for you. This isn't the end of the story. It's the opening condition for what comes next. If you want to understand how this system continues to rewire itself, stay with this channel. Follow the pattern across cases, across borders. The next shift won't look dramatic either, but it will matter just as much.